So, in light of the impending civil war in Ethiopia, so just a bit of context, real quick. There's a region of Ethiopia called Tigray. There is a militarized force there called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. And essentially, they are unhappy with the central government of Ethiopia, and they have decided to take that dissatisfaction to arms and are moved through the country, conquering towns, displacing the Ethiopian military, and as of recently, they've aligned themselves with another armed anti-government group, and they are going to push towards the capital. Okay. So in light of all that, I wanted to talk a little bit about countries with artificial boundaries and sectarian violence. And in this segment, by using the word sectarian, I don't mean like religious or anything specific. I just mean like some sector of the population being antagonistic to another sector of the population, or multiple sectors of the population being antagonistic to multiple sectors of the population. Doesn't really matter, right? Sectarianism is just more or less one group or multiple groups being opposed to one group or multiple groups in a population, okay? And then that coming to fighting, whether it's with arms or not, okay? Or just political disagreements, right? It's entirely possible that this is the way. So, Ethiopia is in Africa, lots of countries in Africa, and after the 1880s, commonly known as the Scramble for Africa, after I think a conference in Brussels, I'm forgetting the name of it exactly, or Berlin, I can't think of this. Oh, it's a shame that I can't remember this. Doesn't matter. So, all of the nations in Africa, almost all of them, pretty much all of them, have what I will call forced borders, which is to say that the present land borders of almost all of these countries were established by outsiders. In Africa, it's primarily Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Portugal, the primary creators of these land borders. And oftentimes, these borders were drawn without any respect to who lived there. It was about what you could claim quickly, as in who could send explorers where, and what natural resources were held, and also what natural avenues there were from the internal portions of the country to the sea, because these countries were set up for colonial purposes for the most part, which is to say that resources were raw resources were extracted from the colony and sent out towards the mother country, who then manufactured finished goods and then sent them back and sold them for profit. Okay, it's more or less how colonialism works. So, when you have a country with borders like this, and by the way, the Middle East is like this a lot as well, you are going to have sectarian violence. Always. Because if you think about it, in a nation where people did not get to choose with whom they live from a fundamental sectarian manner, then there will always be one of two things occurring. So one of three things occurring. One, there will be hostile symbiosis, which I'm defining as you live in a country with your group, and you're antagonistic to the other groups in the country, but you remain in the country because there's benefits to it. You live in harmony with the other groups, and this is just kind of regular symbiosis or peaceful symbiosis, I guess you'd call it. There are other groups there, but you've figured out your differences with them, and maybe it's political, but there's no issue there. Or you just live in constant hostility, which is to say that you are hostile to the other groups in the country, and you are actively in the process of trying to remove yourself or themselves from the country for that reason. And in Europe, where many of the national boundaries were formed by the long, painstaking process of nation state building, oftentimes this was done in a co cultural way or co religious way. A great example of this is the way that Germany, modern day Germany, was created, which essentially was that Prussia, which was the largest of the what we would now call German principalities, essentially decided one day that it was going to conquer everybody else and create Germany. Bismarck, by the way, Otto von Bismarck was the chief architect of this, as well as his patron, Emperor Wilhelm. And they just went through and military conquered all these people. But all these folks spoke the same language. They had cultural things in common. And although Germany was essentially assembled by conquest and deal making, the people who were brought into this new German country, it was Prussia at the time, or Bavaria, it was Prussia, sorry, at the time, the large nation that became Germany. They all had enough in common that the being brought together was not actually an issue. And you see this in the formation of lots of European states, where people are allowed to form large nation states by their co-culturalism. And you see this in the Far East as well. Essentially, any area that wasn't colonized, you kind of see this natural evolution of nation state building, which is co-cultural groups create, make deals with each other to create nation states, and those typically perpetuate to the modern day. Okay, and by the way, an example of a nation state that does not have a co-cultural background is Belgium. Belgium is a tripartite nation. They have the Flemish, the French, and the Germans, three groups who make up the Belgian population and government, right? Their reserve seats. There are ways to keep sectarian violence at bay. So it's not to say that it can't be done, but those groups actually had the opportunity to come together and be a nation, right? They formed that more or less on their own. It was not superimposed on them, or if it was so long ago that at this point it no longer matters, right? But if you look at Africa and the Middle East, and especially places like Ethiopia or Sudan, or Mauritania and Western Sahara, and a whole bunch of places where you can see this sectarian, and even Nigeria, by the way, where you can see the sectarianism, these borders were forced on these people without any sense of who they were and whether they played nice with the rest of the people in the playground, right? So let's take Nigeria, for example. So Nigeria has three major ethnic groups. They have the Hausa Fulani, they have the Igbo, and they have the Yoruba, the three major ethnic groups there. Now, Nigeria was cut up without the consent of any of those three people. And by the way, the Yoruba are not just confined to Nigeria. They also exist in Benin and Togo, nations to Nigeria's west. The Igbo don't just exist in Nigeria. They also have roots in nations to the east of Nigeria, including Cameroon. And the Hausa Fulani have a significant presence in Niger and other surrounding nations, including Cameroon, right? So if Africa had the opportunity to kind of grow up on its own, we might have a Hausa Fulani land, a Yoruba land, and an Igbo land, and you might have had different groups of people in different countries create their own nation states based on their co-culturalism and background. But that was not the case. So these groups compete against each other for resources and for political power. And in doing so, they may come to violence because they've been pitted against each other for colonial purposes, while this whole colonial project has gone forward, right? Remember, it's easier for a colonizer to create a situation where they're not the bad guy, but the other ethnic group is the bad guy. So you have these artificial borders that are created. And on top of that, you have the colonial power, who is essentially the root of all evil in most of these quote unquote countries, essentially saying that, hey, don't look up, look next to you, right? So you create the situation where no matter what happens, you are pushing the situation to the point of dangerous violence, because these groups were not really ever meant to be friends, right? Now, mind you, it may have come about that they all formed their own nation states and then became friends later, but you have to let them do that on their own. When you create a situation where these distinct groups are competing for resources, and by the way, because of the mass extraction that colonial powers did to colonized powers, oftentimes these resources in the modern era are greatly reduced from the what they would have been if these nations had grown up on their own. You increase competition because there is actual scarcity in some of these places. So, as opposed to manufactured scarcity, which is what we see in rich nations. So, essentially, at the end of all this, you get to the situation where it's very dangerous for smaller groups to compete. And the more that these individual ethnic groups feel that they are being outcompeted or that they're not being treated fairly, they're going to want to break away. And by the way, it is very rare that the segregation of a country is done peacefully. Nigeria, again, serves as a great example here. There was a civil war because the Igbo wanted to leave. They said, hey, this situation ain't working for us. We're going to leave. And the Nigerian nation declared war on them and fought to get them back, and eventually won. The Igbo are back in Nigeria. But essentially, and by the way, we're seeing this now in Tigray, right, in Ethiopia, because these nations were not built properly. So because of the way that these nations were established, you are never going to be in a situation where there is likely to be kind of a harmonious coexistence between the ethnic groups, because each of them see each other as enemies in many cases, but also as in the case of resources for in many of these countries, it's a zero-sum game, right? You get the resources, so you don't get the resources. It's not like in rich countries where there are lots and lots of resources. Where do you think we got those resources from? We stole them from poor countries, from developing countries, from colonized countries. So we've essentially created a perfect storm where no matter where you have forced borders, whether it's Africa or the Middle East or what have you, where other nations have drawn borders and drawn artificial delineations between distinct cultural groups who have antagonistic goals, which is to provide themselves with resources, not necessarily anybody else with resources, you create sectarianism. And if that particular struggle becomes acute enough, you create sectarian violence. And so what we're seeing now in Tigray, and what we saw with Darfur in Sudan and South Sudan and Sudan, and what we see, what we see with the PKK in Turkey, coming from northern Syria, all these places where there are kind of cultural revolutionaries and cultural rebellions. What we see is that in situations where borders are forced, there is always sectarian violence, or there's always sectarianism in some way, shape, or form. So what's the solution, right? We can't go back in time and change it. Colonialism happened. All this stuff happened. We can't change it. We can't change the past to have it change now. What we can do is we can say that, hey, if you want to break away from this particular nation, that's fine, but it needs to be done in a way that is peaceful. It needs to be done in a way that ensures that people who want to leave are able to leave. And it has to be done in a way where resources are not intentionally deprived from other groups, because then it doesn't become sectarian violence, it just becomes regular old war. And you essentially have the same problem, just it looks a little different, right? So, and by the way, the obligation to do all of this is on rich countries, right? We, and I do include myself in this, right? As people who live in rich countries, are benefiting from the pilfering of the resource supplies of poorer countries, of colonized countries. We bear the blame for the reason, for the overall reason that much of this is occurring in the first place. So if we are going to benefit from all of this shenanigans, all these shenanigans, we then need to put our cards on the table and be honest with the people that we have, for whom we've created this problem. And we have to do the hard work of allowing groups of people who want to be independent, but also to allow for the joint survivability of both of these nations. Because it's no good to just say, oh, you can go on your own, it's fine. Hey, country who's afraid of losing this group, don't be afraid of that. Don't react angrily to them, just let them go. Because oftentimes, and sometimes the specific reason for the sectarianism is because one group may sit on some resources that the other group wants, right? So, and they may use the power of national unity as a sinister ploy to extract the resources from a particular group who wants to maintain ownership of that resource. So again, that's fair, but there's an obligation there to ensure that individual groups who want to become independent are allowed to do so, but also there needs to be work done to maintain the peace, right? Because if they have a specific resource, or if they're moving for resource purposes, they want to declare independence for resource purposes, you get to a situation where it becomes untenable to just tell them that leaving is okay, right? Because you're just going to have that same violence. It's just going to look different. So I guess the closing thought of this segment is that while we can't go back and change the colonial past to allow nations, to allow cultural groups, co-cultural groups to grow up into nation states on their own, what we can do as rich nations is to facilitate and broker agreements between aggrieved parties and to allow for as many independent ethnic groups to gain national status as desire to do so. But to make sure that effort to create, that efforts to perpetuate self-determinism, which is just a fancy way of saying to allow people to do what they want, in order to perpetuate self-determinism, we also need to make sure that that in allowing that to perpetuate, we don't create more sectarianism, more violence, more war, and more death, right? The whole purpose of this exercise would be to create more peace. So if we allow for independent groups to become independent and don't mitigate the reasons for their independence and the reason that another group might want them back, we have not helped the process of peace. We have facilitated self-determinism at the expense of lasting peace, and we cannot do that. That is not a sustainable way of doing this. So if we are going to do the work, the real work of allowing for individual nation states to develop based on co-culturalism and anti-sectarianism, we need to also perpetuate the means that would allow for peace to be maintained between the departing group and the remaining group or groups.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.